story of the ancient king of Macedonia, Alexander the Great. I know we think of him as a Greek. He's Macedonian. And whether it's a true story or not, it certainly tells a tale. And the tale is told that one day a beggar by the roadside was begging for alms as Alexander the Great and his entourage passed by. The man was clearly destitute. He was also quite bold and presumptuous in asking for alms from such a powerful ruler. And yet the emperor stopped and he threw the beggar some gold coins. His courtier was flabbergasted by the act of generosity and commented, "Sir, copper coins would have adequately met the beggar's need. Why give him gold?" Alexander responded with the kind of conviction and certainty that characterized his exploits. He said, "Copper coins could suit the beggar's needs, but gold coins suit Alexander's giving." Copper coins could suit the beggar's needs, but gold coins suit Alexander's giving. We who follow Jesus, the King of Kings, walk in the way of the King of Kings. The question before us on this last of our emphasis of the 5 practices is, what kind of giving suits the children of God? What is extravagant generosity? We have examples of it in each of our readings for today. The widow of Zarephath from our first reading practices a form of hospitality, trusting in the promises of God given to her through the prophet, giving risk-taking mission and service. You're noticing how she's hitting all 5 of these. Sacrificing and demonstrating her extravagant generosity of heart, that she was willing to do what was asked of her, and no doubt it was extravagant and sacrificial. Paul is writing in our text today from 2 Corinthians to the church at Corinth, and he's telling them about the generosity of his Macedonian counterparts, which were a poor church in comparison to the wealth of the city of Corinth. And he was telling them how exuberant, enthusiastic, and generous beyond what they ever expected the Macedonians were, and he was encouraging them to be generous as well in their offering to the church in persecution in Jerusalem. And in the time of Jesus, in our gospel lesson for today, Jesus is essentially telling us that we're to be generous of heart, large-hearted people, generous of spirit towards others, being extravagant in our loving, being extravagant in our forgiving, in our giving, in our living as God's people who are dearly loved by an extravagantly generous God. Copper coins would suit the beggar's need, but gold coins suit the giving of the children of God. Yet, stewardship sermons are never popular. In fact, the best faces I get from the congregation are always during stewardship sermons, usually some kind of grimace or growling kind of look that often happens. And the responses are always priceless, of course. There's a mix of responses between guilt and hostility and self-justification. Sort of looking for the loophole. Well, is that before taxes or after taxes? Money in our society is a funny thing, isn't it? It is a highly personalized thing. We will share incredible amount of intimate detail about ourselves, including our sex lives, but when it comes to talking about money, let's not bring that up. We get nervous whenever the topic is brought up in church, and yet it's the one thing that Jesus talks about more than almost anything else except for love and forgiveness. Money. In some of the material that we're reading, maybe you came across this story as well, is the story of Reverend Alan Bevar of First United Methodist Church in Cambridge, Ohio, who would regularly go legally to Cuba to do training of pastors there. He was recalling that the Methodist Church in Cuba is in revival, doubling its membership every 2 years. The same is true in the Lutheran Church in some parts of Africa and some parts of Asia. The average age of worshipers in Cuba is in his or her 20s. Tithing is one of the requirements of the church in Cuba. In fact, the giving of each member is made a part of public record. It's posted in the sanctuary by name. Yes, you gave me the reaction that his congregation gave him. He writes, every time I tell that story to Christians here back home, the looks on people's faces tell the story, as yours just did. It's as if their faces are saying, I'm sure glad we don't do that in our church. Oftentimes, he writes, the reason for keeping an individual's giving private is to meet Jesus' adage from the Sermon on the Mount. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, or don't let somebody else know what you're giving. But he says, my suspicion is that's just a cover excuse. The real reason that most of us don't want to have our giving made public is that it's one area in our lives that is not in order with our discipleship, that we're not doing it. If there's one realm of behavior that's not been given over to the lordship of Jesus, it's the sphere of the financial. We know the statistics well. The rich may give more dollars than the poor total, but the poor, year after year after year, proportionally, extravagantly outgive the rich. There's something about adding silver that changes glass into a mirror, and that we can only see ourself when we accumulate enough in it. The same is being said in our reading from Paul to the Corinthians. Corinthians is like the first dysfunctional church family, and Paul is trying to motivate their generosity out of their great wealth, asking them to have the same enthusiasm and the same generosity as their poorer neighbors in Macedonia. I've told the story before in the context of baptism about in the time of Constantine and his armies, that when Constantine converted, of course, the whole empire converted as well. And so as his soldiers would go into battle, many times they would go into the waters of baptism to be baptized, to be given the assurance of God's presence and the sort of the blessing of the emperor. But as they'd go into the water and they'd wade out, they would lift their swords out over their heads, and they would be out of the water as sort of a sense that there was something that was in reserve that was no longer Christian. They themselves were baptized in water and covered by that grace, but their swords were something else. I think we do the same thing with our wallets. As we're drowning in the waters of baptism, we reach back or into our purses. We lift them up. Not yet. I still have plans for that. I have designs on that. And we save that part of ourselves. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's kind of a counterintuitive idea. We often think, where our heart is, where our investment is, where our person is, that's where we'll invest. But that's not what he's saying. He's actually saying where the rubber's meeting the road, that's where your heart will eventually end up. And I think that's also true. Jesus' words emphasize not only that how we spend our money reveals the kind of people we are, but also how we spend our money demonstrates the kind of people that we will become as well. Martin Luther, our namesake, of course, and the spark of the Protestant Reformation, talked about Christians needing three types of conversion: the conversion of the heart, the conversion of the mind, and the conversion of the purse. And I find that true in my own life. Luther knew how deeply satisfying the spiritual life could be, but he also understood unless we committed our whole selves to it without reservation, without having a kind of extravagant generosity missing from our spiritual formation, we would never come to know the full satisfaction for ourselves, because money is a matter of the heart. In the last chapter of Fruitful Giving, and some of you have been reading the devotional book, I'm grateful for that. You should have read all but the last, maybe unless you got up early and read the last devotion. This is the last one. And the last section of that, of course, is on extravagant giving. The bishop who wrote the material is inviting us to practice living in an extravagantly generous way, not because the church needs to receive your money, but as an action of spiritual growth and a spiritual maturation, of change in our lives. If we put our treasure, whatever you might see that is, time, talents, our treasure, into our faith, our hearts follow it there. We become shaped by those sorts of things. I'm putting a lot of money right now into the music programs at Westlake High School. It's compulsory. And yet what I find in it is that the more that happens, the more it is a center of my gravity. And I'm pulled into it. And you know what I find? I love it. It's amazing. It's outstanding. It's incredible. Where my treasure went, at first begrudgingly, my heart has followed, and it's shaping me. It's changed me, mostly for the good. Now, the church is a collection of individuals who are somewhat like-minded in the sense that we see ourselves as trying to grow in a certain way. We're on the same team, practicing counterintuitive practices, the 5 we've talked about that are lined up behind me on the floor or hanging above me. And today, this countercultural skill of extravagant generosity. It's countercultural. Now, some of you are extravagantly generous. And I can't wait for the day I can tell the story, but while you're here, I can't, because I know that for most of you, it would embarrass you, and you wouldn't want to have it shared. And for others, it might shock or even shame you by the source of some extravagant giving coming from very humble places at times. So I had to reach back and think about folks in my past. And I remember someone that I knew in my childhood, but I remember mostly from my college days. I went to a university close to my home, so I was home fairly often. And I remember this Christian man as a person of extravagant generosity. I never thought of it this way until the term was applied. He was a guy that was a great mechanic. He worked on lots of people's cars. He took wonderful care of his own car, and he always aged it out. You know, sort of like a Pastor Bob, always driving the old Falcon. You know, but he was always good at keeping it up. It was always in great condition. But eventually, he decided they would buy a brand new car, because he hadn't had a brand new car for a while, and he thought he would see what kind of new technology there was, so he bought himself a brand new car. It was a beautiful car. Now, this is back in the 70s and 80s. And this man had an elderly widow in my town, and she drove a car that had seen its best days. In fact, I think it had also seen its worst days already. Those were past it as well. And as I said, this neighbor, this guy, was a terrific mechanic, and oftentimes he would be working on this elderly widow's car because she was running into problems. And he would always fix it for free, and he would always try not to charge her for the parts, and she'd always insist, and there was always this comical sort of conversation that went on between the two of them in town. It was fairly well known of the link and the connection between, the deep connection between these two people. She was always so grateful and always so generous to him, although she lived on, of course, a widow's fixed and meager kind of income. One Saturday, not long after he got his new car, he once again was in his garage working on his neighbor's car, the widow's car. It had a variety of problems and was leaving her stranded from time to time, as it would just sort of stall out at stoplights. Well, there weren't any. There were one in my town, but it was only on during school hours. She went out of town. It would stop at stop signs. It would stall out. It would leave her on the side of the road. Now, she was an elderly woman, and it suddenly hit this guy, this realization that she couldn't deal with the problems of her car, and that he could deal with the problems of her car, and that she couldn't deal with being stranded along the side of the road. And suddenly, he realized what he had to do. And he went inside his house, he retrieved his new car keys, and he drove his new car next door into her driveway, into her garage, and he went inside and offered, in fact, insisted that she drive his car and that they would trade cars. I never thought of it as extravagant generosity, because that's kind of how that guy was. He was a great guy. He would give you the shirt off his back because he was a great neighbor, and that's how we thought of him. But it was that kind of extravagant generosity, that big-hearted generosity, that I think is supposed to characterize us as God's children, those of us who have received in extravagant ways grace beyond grace. I invite you to look again at our 3 readings from Scripture, all implying the encouragement to a kind of trust in God's extravagance for us. And therefore, God's generosity generates generosity of heart and life in us. That's its source. When the church practices a kind of extravagant generosity, and you know it, some of you could tell some really amazing stories on this congregation, we can see in those moments how it radiates the resurrected life that Jesus wants us to live into in this world. It reveals to the world that eternity has come into the present just for a moment. It shocks us, it alarms us, it brings us to tears, it humbles us, and that this world, with all of its needs, matters to God. our giving should suit what it means to be the children of God, just like gold coins suited Alexander's giving. What does it mean for us to be subject to the King of Kings, who receive more generosity than we could ever imagine, who receive more than we could ever repay, who receive more than we could ever pay forward? If we were to give as those who are made in the image of God, what kind of extravagant generosity would you practice? Amen.